As Ben mentioned, I am a developer turned CEO from Dallas. And first of all, just want to say howdy. I want to welcome everyone. I have just really wanted a Magento event in Texas, and especially a developer-focused Magento event in Texas for years. Just really had a huge desire for that. A few years ago, I looked into what it would take for my company to put that on, realized it takes a lot of money and a lot of time. So I just want to say a huge thanks to Space 48 and the Shipper HQ and all the sponsors, because it is just awesome for me, born and raised in Texas, finally having so many great Magento developers visit us here has been really cool. So a little bit about me, you heard some earlier, so I'm just going to skim through this, but been working with Magento since 2008, started with Magento 2 in 2014. I'm founder and CEO of Creativity. We're a Magento enterprise solution partner out of Dallas. So what I'm talking about today is integrations, and first and foremost, these are complex data-intensive integrations. So this isn't your real simple, lightweight, basic integration. This is when, say, you're working with an ERP, you're working with an accounting package, and you're moving a lot of data back and forth. So I want to talk about basically the better way to do this now in Magento 2. And we do have a new option in Magento 2 that I'm going to walk you through, and I'm going to kind of show you what it is and how we can use it. So Magento 1, we basically had two options, and in the very early days we had one option. We had the SOAP API. Then later on the REST API was added in. So that was pretty much, you wanted to integrate something with Magento 1, that's how you were doing it. Magento 2, we still have the SOAP API, we still have the REST API. We may or may not be getting webhooks. I've heard so many things back and forth. I know the community actually has an extension out there that adds webhooks that's a little alpha and rough around the edges, but we may see webhooks at some point. And then we have RabbitMQ, and that's the method I'm going to talk about today. And so Rabbit, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a messaging queue, and we heard a little bit from Eugene yesterday about Rabbit, and he dove into some really good technical details, whereas I'm going to talk more on the architectural side of why and when to use Rabbit. So again, RabbitMQ, it's a messaging queue, which is exactly what it sounds like. Messages are plain text, process commands, or any other type of information you want. You can actually use any format. The message can be anything you'd like. And then a queue. The queue within RabbitMQ is a place where messages are held until a consumer connects and retrieves them. So again, it's actually at the highest level real simple. It's exactly what it sounds like in the name. So in other words, when I started thinking about RabbitMQ and hearing it described, the very first thing I thought of is the joke of the internet is a series of tubes. All RabbitMQ really is a series of tubes. It connects different things that are providing messages to different things that are consuming those messages. And of course, I always have to have a cat meme. So not only is the internet a series of tubes, those tubes are full of cats. So your messages in RabbitMQ can be anything. You actually could use it to send cat memes back and forth if you wanted to. So waiting to see who does that first. On a more serious level, though, this is actually kind of what those tubes look like in RabbitMQ. So you have a publisher. That's just the piece of software that is generating the message that it's giving to RabbitMQ. So in our case, the example I'm going to show, the publisher is Magento. Magento is creating a message and publishing it out into RabbitMQ. Within RabbitMQ itself, there's an exchange that then routes the message to a queue. So it looks at the message, and we'll talk in a second about how it does that routing, but it takes that message and it puts it into the right queue. Once that message is in a queue, then the consumer, which again is just any piece of software that connects to Rabbit, the consumer will connect to that queue and it will consume that message. It will basically say, give me the next message in that queue, and it will pull it out of there. So RabbitMQ, I don't know if there's anyone, Spinal Tap fans in the audience from the Spinal Tap movie, but RabbitMQ, like they say in Spinal Tap, it goes to 11. It's a very high performance tool. It's definitely much more scalable than using a REST API, a SOAP API, that sort of thing. There's actually, I'll have the slides online right after my talk and I'll tweet them out, but Google and Pivotal Labs just recently did a test where RabbitMQ is able to sort and deliver over 1 million messages per second. So you want to talk about performance and scalability. You can actually move 1 million messages per second through Rabbit. And again, try that with especially a SOAP API, and that's going to be not a very fun day. The most powerful part of this is Magento actually hands the message off to RabbitMQ to be handled asynchronously. So again, going back to the old way, the old APIs, the old approach, you aren't working asynchronously. That means you're stopping, you're putting the data out there, you're waiting for a response. Using Rabbit, that's all done asynchronously, it's not blocking, and so it's so much faster. Also, RabbitMQ can be clustered as you scale up. You can have a whole cluster of RabbitMQ servers, so I really do think that there's really no upper bound that anyone has found for what you can do with RabbitMQ. Again, go back to Google doing that testing, showing 1 million messages per second. I don't think there's a lot of cases out there where we're needing to move messages back and forth between APIs at over 1 million messages per second. Also, the change in approach that RabbitMQ allows that I'm most excited about is that it allows you to completely decouple your Magento code from your actual integrations using these messages. So we've inherited a lot of projects where we see, buried in a Magento extension is a ton of code that's actually just calling out a library that someone provided. Let's say like an Amazon SDK. And so someone is loading in an entire Amazon SDK within a Magento extension just to communicate with an API. You don't have to do that if you're using RabbitMQ. With Rabbit, you can actually just push your messages out into the queue, and then you can use pre-existing code or write your own code to be that consumer off of the RabbitMQ queue and have your integration there, run your Amazon SDK or whatever sort of library you're using on that end, keep it completely decoupled from your Magento code, keep it in a separate code base, even a separate server if you'd like, and just really simplifies things. And that's something that it took a while for the magnitude of that to really sink in for me, and we'll talk about that more in a second. But to harness the power of RabbitMQ, to really get that advantage out of it, in the words of Apple, you have to think different. You have to approach APIs and integrations completely and totally differently. So what I want to kind of work through as an example is bidirectional sync between an ERP or an OMS and Magento. And our old way is pretty simple. It's basically you fire off a single message via SOAP or REST API, and you say, hey, I have a new order. I'm going to send it out, kind of like this flare, out to my OMS or ERP. So you might fire an event, have an observer, it handles sending that data to the ERP. Again, you can see how that's not necessarily super scalable. There's definitely a lot of room for bottlenecks there. So the new way that we can do with RabbitMQ is more like this, is firing off lots and lots and lots of messages at once. Again, because it's all asynchronously. So basically, the new way, you fire a message to RabbitMQ, you move on. You're not blocking, you're not waiting, you're not even necessarily waiting for another server to respond or anything like that. And this is, again, I think Eugene did a great job with the code yesterday, so I'm not going to dive into too much of the code or show too much of this example. But basically, it's super simple. Anytime there's something new, a new feature in Magento over the years, I've kind of learned to sit there and say, okay, how hard is this going to be to learn? And how hard is this going to be to integrate? Luckily, Rabbit is actually super simple. That code right there is using a publisher class built into Magento, using that interface to publish a message. In this case, the message topic, that first variable there, is creativity sent OMS, and then you pass whatever your message is. So in our case, we're actually passing an entire variable as that message. So the topic, that creativity.sent.oms, this is really the most powerful part of harnessing Rabbit and using Rabbit. Rabbit can actually be configured to use topics to route messages to specific queues. And I'll show you a graphic in a second about that. But basically, within Rabbit, you can have many different queues. You can connect different publishers and different consumers to those, and you can route the messages based on these topics. You can actually do wildcard routing, so you could say creativity.star, and that says any topic, any message that comes in to Rabbit whose topic starts with creativity, we're going to route it this one way. You could also do very granular specific routing. So you could say, okay, only things that are creativity.sent.oms should be routed in this way. And so topics allow your consumers that are connected to Rabbit to easily grab only the messages that are important to them. And hopefully this is fairly readable, but again, all the slides online. This is a really good example from Red Hat, just showing how powerful that routing can be. So across the top, you have 4 different producers. So this could be, for instance, 4 different systems that you have within your Magento 2 site. They each use a different topic. So USA.news, USA.weather, Europe.news, Europe.weather. Within Rabbit, then, you can have different queues. You could have one that just gets everything for the US. You could have one that's all news, one that's all weather, one that's all Europe. And so you can actually see how messages can be sent to multiple queues. If you want them to be sent to multiple queues, they can be sent to a single queue, and then the consumers just connect to the specific queues that they're interested in. So your code that needs to handle anything that's related to the weather just connects to the queue that is pound.weather there. So that way, without writing a lot of logic into your Magento integrations, just by how you're setting up your Rabbit instance, you can do really complex routing of messages. And again, messages can be an object, they can be a string, they can be literally anything you'd like. And one thing that's really powerful about this is the application on either end of the integration can just use their native format. So if you're integrating with something that wants to use XML, the messages that you push into Rabbit can be in XML, and then on the other end, when that's consumed, it comes out already in that XML, ready to go for that integration. And I do recommend keep your messages simple. I've seen people spend a lot of time writing out really advanced specifications for what these messages should look like. My recommendation is keep them really simple, keep them as close as possible to whatever system you're integrating with. And then when responses come back, so I've talked about how Magento can push messages into Rabbit. Magento can also be a consumer. It can actually pull messages back out of those queues in Rabbit. So in our case, when we send an order out to that OMS, we're going to want to get a response back that'll have some information in it that aids us in our order processing. And that's all done via communication.xml. And again, I'll have this online where it'll be a little easier to read. But basically, we say anytime there's a message in creativity.oms.sent.magento, call this particular function and save it into Magento. So that allows us to connect a custom function in Magento to messages within RabbitMQ. And then this is super simple example here of basically that function would just get the information from the message, save it in the Magento order. So again, we're not writing a whole lot of code to actually connect to the OMS because all of that's done through Rabbit. We basically have Magento pushing the information into Rabbit. The OMS and the OMS team has integrated the OMS into Rabbit as well, and Rabbit serves as that conduit between the two. So advantages of Rabbit: it can route messages to specific queues for you, and again, that can be very, very powerful. You can route to multiple queues. You can route to queues in such a way that certain functions and certain integrations will receive only the messages that they need. One thing that I really like is the way it does decouple your code from the API on the other side of the integration. So let's say you're using one ERP now, and a year from now you're told that you're switching to a different ERP. You're not going to have to go through and refactor and change a bunch of code in your Magento instance. You're just going to change what sits on the other side of RabbitMQ. So that really simplifies that. There's also a RabbitMQ client for every major language. So if you have a project on the other side of that integration that is in pretty much any language you can think of, there's a native client for RabbitMQ. So it can connect to just about anything. And then one thing that I've really enjoyed, and the team members that have used this so far have really enjoyed, is that as Magento developers, we write Magento code, and ERP developers on the other side write the ERP code. So we're not having to sit there and figure out how do we integrate with this ERP, how does it work. We just write Magento code, all the information gets pushed into RabbitMQ, the ERP team is responsible for then picking up those messages, processing it on their end, allowing a very clean separation between those two projects. There are a few gotchas with RabbitMQ. First of all, I was giving Chuck a hard time about this earlier. I kind of feel like I'm playing whack-a-mole between Magento 2.0, 2.1, and 2.2 with Rabbit. They all contain major changes to message queues. Luckily, it sounds like most of the changes in 2.2 won't necessarily break things from 2.1. It will just add new functionality. But there's actually some code in 2.0 for Rabbit that we... Oh, Chuck is telling me no, we're breaking things. So, all right, we are breaking things in 2.2. But anyway, so yeah, there was some code in 2.0 that I don't even think was necessarily highlighted as a feature that was added in 2.0 around message queues that we started playing with, and maybe we shouldn't have. And sure enough, in 2.1, it wasn't working. And so a lot of things had changed, and there's more changes coming. This is a very new technology to be integrated with Magento, so I do expect there to be some more disruptions. So just be aware of that as you start using Rabbit. The other thing with Rabbit is it is a Magento Enterprise only functionality, so you can't use this on your community projects. Honestly, if you have someone that's doing an integration that's a large enough scale to need Rabbit, they probably also need to be on Enterprise. So that distinction does make sense to me, but it's something to be aware of. You can't just go out there and blanket recommend it to everyone, because if they're on community, they will be disappointed. And then the last kind of gotcha about Rabbit is it adds a new layer to your stack. These great DevOps presentations today, when you add RabbitMQ, it is a service that you're going to have to run. So it does add a little bit more complexity, something else for your team to maintain. One thing I've actually talked to the Magento team about is possibly using Magento Cloud Edition to offset this. So instead of, if you are worried that you're going to be stretching your team by supporting RabbitMQ in addition to everything else for this kind of integration, Magento Cloud does have a way that you can use RabbitMQ with it, so that might offset some of that. So I have some homework for y'all, just a little bit. So I would definitely encourage you to go try RabbitMQ out. There are both Vagrant and Docker images for the actual Rabbit server, so it's really easy to spin up a server and just start playing with it. Like Kevin was saying earlier, I would start with the basics, so I wouldn't even integrate Magento into Rabbit at first. I would just download some PHP code. There's some PHP samples for interacting with Rabbit, and just play with pushing messages back and forth through Rabbit. Once you kind of get that under your belt, then integrate it into your Magento instance, start playing with it. Biggest thing, though, I want you to take away from this is that there's one key to success with RabbitMQ, using Rabbit for your integrations, and really all of Magento 2. Stop trying to apply the old patterns and the old techniques. Stop trying to do things the old way. So if you approach Magento 2 as, I want this to work like Magento 1, you're going to have a frustrating time. It is basically a new platform. There are entirely new approaches in it. Same thing with Rabbit. RabbitMQ, if you approach it as, I'm going to write this the same way I would develop and design a SOAP API, it just doesn't even make sense. It's a completely and totally different way of thinking about integrations. From being asynchronous to the way messages are routing to the way the queues work, it's totally different. So don't try to think of it just like a SOAP or REST API. Definitely keep up with the new features and the architectural advances. Again, Rabbit's going to change in Magento 2.2. Will probably change in 2.3. Stay on top of that, just so you understand kind of where it's going. But remember that it enables us to quickly integrate third-party systems in a totally new way. This is sort of a new toy for us that we've never been able to play with in Magento. So it is a new way to integrate with third-party systems, and I think that for large-scale integrations, it's going to be the best way and really the only option to consider in a lot of cases. And again, we still don't know the upper bound of Magento 2's scalability. I think so few people have even started to use Rabbit with Magento 2 that we haven't found that upper limit yet, and that's exciting to me. Like, I really enjoy pushing the envelope, building out bigger sites, bigger integrations, bigger catalogs. So I definitely encourage y'all to go out there and just play with it. Just see how much you can push through Magento 2 using Rabbit. So the main homework is take that to heart and go out and build something awesome with Magento 2 and RabbitMQ.